you have too much credit created, too much money creation as credit, and that causes a diversion of resources. It causes misallocation of capital. You get a false boom, a kind of candy floss rush of investment, but it's ultimately founded on sand.
The methods of money production in society today are profoundly corrupting in ways that would matter to everyone if they were clearly understood.
For 50 years, governments have been living beyond their means, and since the end of Bretton Woods, it's been currency debasement that's eventually done the heavy lifting. The vast majority of members of parliament in the UK, and I don't doubt politicians everywhere, scarcely understand economics. They scarcely understand the figures.
In a system that is based on trust, one that has arguably been squandered away through our monetary and fiscal irresponsibility, we're creating $100,000 worth of debt per second, $1 trillion every 90 days.
The biggest bubble in history has been blown, and I'm really concerned about it. Power goes to those who turn up. So I'd encourage anyone to inform themselves, stay calm, stay polite, but go and see their politicians, go to the meetings, engage, and make clear what you want is an honest system, one where politicians and the state live within their means, and the public get to keep more of their money. The truth is that the sustainable, just and inclusive prosperity is built on sound money. And that's why I'm so excited about what the private sector is doing, what people are doing through voluntary cooperation in gold, in silver, in Bitcoin.
Hey everybody, my name is Jason Cousins, and I'm here, of course, today with my co-host Andy Schechtman. How you doing, Andy?
Jason, I'm doing good, buddy. Just hoping that the hurricane doesn't come south and doesn't change its mind and make a right turn and hit us over here in southern Florida on the East Coast. It's my prayers and thoughts go out to everyone, of course, that have already been affected by the hurricanes in North Carolina and what is to come here in the next 24 hours on the West Coast, Tampa Bay and Sarasota and everyone in its path. My thoughts and prayers are with everyone, but it's good to be here and good to see you, brother. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm pretty good. And yeah, definitely. I'm sure our viewers and myself, everyone at Glint is thinking about you guys in Florida and hope that this one isn't as bad as the last one. Fingers crossed. But today, 11th episode, Andy, 11th episode. We're getting there, building up. We're going to be saying the big 100 soon before you know it. Today is our 11th episode, and we've got a real treat for everybody. I'd like to introduce everybody to Steve Baker, the Right Honourable Steve Baker. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me on, Jason. I really appreciate you and Andy bringing me onto your podcast. And let me say that I too am worried about those in Florida, and Godspeed to everyone. It's an awful time.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Listen, a little bit about you, Steve. You're the Right Honourable Steve Baker. You're a notable figure in UK politics. You served as a Conservative MP for Wickham from 2010 to 24. Previously a former Royal Air Force engineer and consultant, often seen jumping out of aeroplanes and riding your very fast motorbikes. You were Treasury Select Committee chair and widely recognised.
Jason, I just should pick you up on that. I wasn't the chairman.
Okay.
I did eventually become the longest serving member of the Treasury Select Committee, but I didn't actually go.
You're also widely recognised for your role, of course, in Brexit, where you earned the reputation as the Brexit hard man for your staunch support of the Leave campaign and leadership within the European Research Group, ERG, which is, for those people who don't know, a group of conservative Eurosceptics. And your influence extended way beyond Brexit, as you were involved in some really key roles, such as being Minister of State for Northern Ireland, and where you did some great work. And you played a role in scrutinising the UK's COVID-19 response and policies on net zero emissions.
Yeah.
But Steve, you've been very vocal about concerns over economic and fiscal policies since before I met you, particularly in relation to government spending and debt. And we'll be talking about that today. You've championed free market principles. I'd call you a libertarian. You advocate for banking reform, maybe not in the same way as other people want to reform the central bank. But you founded the Cobden Centre, which is a think tank promoting honest money and free trade. And your political stances reflect a deep concern, I'd say, about government overreach, fiscal irresponsibility, the erosion of individual freedoms, topics that I think align with the themes in some charts that we're going to be discussing today. But I could carry on talking a long time about you, Steve, but thank you very much again for coming on the show.
You're very welcome. It's a real joy to be here and to have the opportunity to speak to your viewers, your listeners. And I'll be very interested to see what people say in the comments once we've finished and this goes out. I'm keen to know how people react to what we have to say.
So let's just start a little bit about your personal story, Steve. So you're an aerospace engineer, software engineer, jumping out of airplanes. I've seen the videos.
Yeah.
What interested you in monetary economics and financial systems? Where does this start for you?
It began because I'd left the Royal Air Force to get involved in the dot-com boom back in 1999. And of course, it promptly ended. And that caused me to look around and say, why have entrepreneurs and investors all made basically the same mistake at the same time?
Are you enjoying the show? A quick reminder then to hit the subscribe button so you can be kept up to date about future episodes. Now, back to the show.
And a friend of mine handed me Causes of the Economic Crisis and other essays before and after the Great Depression by Ludwig von Mises. And I thought that makes sense. You have too much credit created, too much money creation as credit, and that causes a diversion of resources. It causes misallocation of capital. You get a false boom, a kind of candy floss rush of investment, but it's ultimately founded on sand, and so the edifice collapses, and so boom bust cycle. And I thought that makes a lot of sense, but it can't be true because politicians and economists would surely do something about it. And that, of course, now seems very naive. But I went on then into business software, and ultimately I found myself as chief architect of two big programs at Lehman Brothers, and it was boom, record quarter after record quarter, and then bust. And I thought, I know what has happened here. We have ridden an enormous credit boom to destruction across the whole world. And that caused me to reach out and start the Cobden Centre with then Toby Baxendale and Anthony Evans, Dr. Anthony Evans. And we set out these ideas on monetary economics, sound monetary economics, and how the boom bust cycle happens and the injustice it creates, the waste of natural resources that it creates, the way it disadvantages those without. So that's how I got into it. And it's been a recurrent theme of my time in politics, although I'm better known for Brexit and net zero and COVID. The truth is, actually, I think that these monetary matters are actually ultimately more important to everyone than all those things for which I'm better known.
And if you cast your mind back into the dusty recesses of that brain of yours, a wonderful brain, you've got a great way of explaining things to people. We've got a quote here from 2014 when you were in the Commons chamber, and you said, the methods of money production in society today are profoundly corrupting in ways that would matter to everyone if they were clearly understood. The essence of this debate is who should be allowed to create money, how, and at whose risk. So I think that was a great start early on in your career to come out with that. Maybe, Ray, you could bring up one of the charts that we've got to go over with Steve, because I think that would be the best way to get through this in this kind of structured manner, because there is a lot to get through.
This chart comes from the UK's Office for Budget Responsibility, and it's part of their Fiscal Risks and Sustainability report. The yellow line is government revenues. So on the white background, that's the past data, and the green background is future projections. And the green line is total government spending. So you can see that there's been deficits. The green line's above the yellow line for year after year. The first peak there is the global financial crisis, and then the second peak is the COVID pandemic. But the crucial point is this, is that in the future, the total government spending line is racing upwards. And even at what are now historically very high levels of taxation, government revenues are stagnant. And that is the essence of the problem. Government likes to live beyond its means. And this is the problem that we've always faced, is that when rulers spend, they've got three ways of obtaining the funds from the public. They can tax, which is to take the money by force today. They can borrow, which is to promise that they will take more money by force in the future. Or they can debase the currency. And by far the stealthiest way of taking the public's resources is, of course, to create new money, whether it's done through the printing press or by melting down coins and putting tin or other metals into them, or whether it's done through new bank lending with very cheap credit and people borrowing the money into existence. That's how it's always been done. And I believe that's been the curse of the last 50 years.
Not just in the UK, in the United States too. It seems that they ought to change the name of that government office to the Office of Financial Irresponsibility. But it's the same thing here in the United States. Since 2023, our federal debt has gone up by $4 trillion or 14%. And at the same time, GDP is up just 1.5 trillion or 6%. In other words, the national debt is outpacing growth by 2.7 times here. And it seems pretty darn close to the same thing there. And yet, the understanding of what inflation is now being misconstrued by rising prices rather than by the irresponsibility of the government, who is spending more than they're taking in taxes. And so they'll just defer to what all politicians have done, to your point, going back to Roman times and clipping the coins, or choosing inflation over austerity. Where does it end? You can just tax the people into nothing, or what? Where does this end?
Yeah, it potentially ends in disaster for the currency. Back in about 2030, I think it was, I referred to a Bank for International Settlements paper on the future of public debt prospects and implications. And they projected out charts of public debt for basically all the developed Western welfare states, including the US. And all those charts headed in that one direction, upwards on the debt. And depending on the demographics of particular countries, it was either feasible or not to make inroads into dealing with that age-related spending. And this is a very serious problem. Look, at the heart of it is a very simple aspect of human nature. People like to receive free stuff. They like low taxes and high spending. And I don't wish to be trite. That is the essence of it. People are always trying to live at someone's expense. This goes back throughout human history. Bastiat famously wrote about it in his essays. That's what the problem is. And I wonder if you could bring up the chart which shows the development of government spending in the UK. That's there, two lines converging. Yeah, so this is the essence of the problem. This chart comes from the Taxpayers Alliance in the UK, and it shows the growth of government spending in the UK. That's the green line coming up as a proportion of GDP, and the black line is the private sector, the remainder. And it goes from 1870 there through up to 2020. Now, usually when people look at the growth of the state, and I've seen it many times, they go back 50 years. But if you look at that chart and go back 50 years, you learn nothing, because 50 years back to 1970, ever since then, we've basically had social democracy. Big government, high taxes, high spending, high regulation, and easy money. But if you look back before the First World War on that chart, that we had an era of classical liberalism. The dominant political economy was that government should be small, it should be limited. And so you can see there that government spending prior to the First World War was about 15% of GDP in the UK. So what happened is we made a transition from a free society, a classical liberal society, through two world wars into this era of interventionism and social democracy. Now, whatever the merits might be of socialised healthcare and state welfare, it is just a matter of fact that prior to the First World War, government was small. And after the Second World War, government's been big and running at and beyond the limits of taxation. And this is the essence of the problem. For 50 years, governments have been living beyond their means. And since the end of Bretton Woods, it's been currency debasement that's eventually done the heavy lifting. It's been devaluing the pound in your pocket, or indeed the dollar. And this is now coming back really heavily to bite us all.
So is it that the heart of the matter? Is it that things like National Health Service and defense and pensions are so expensive, but no government really wants to spell out how expensive they are? And and things like the National Health Service, what a wonderful service it is, but it keeps getting more and more expensive. There's no way to pay for it with our current taxes. But no politician wants to get up and actually give the bitter pill to the electorate and say, actually, this is how much it costs. Therefore, what are we going to do about it? Because nobody wants to hear the bad news. And therefore, the easiest thing to do is just to print the money and have this massive stealth tax through inflation.
Yeah. I must be one of the few MPs who actually has said this to his electors. And the arguments which I'm making to you today, I've made directly to my local electors here in Wickham at presentations, including of local business figures. So people have heard me say it, but there's a difference between it being said by then a backbench MP to their own constituents and a leader of a major political party spelling out what actually the government's own figures say. It's an extraordinary phenomenon that politicians don't confront this. But what I'd say to your listeners, the incredible thing I've found over 14 years in Parliament and on the Treasury Select Committee and talking to MPs, leading a debate in the House of Commons, the vast majority of members of Parliament in the UK, and I don't doubt politicians everywhere, scarcely understand economics. They scarcely understand the figures. There'll be one or two issues that interest them, and much beyond that, they're just trying to cope with what their constituents are saying. And very rarely does anyone lift their eyes up above the horizon and think, what's coming next? And maybe it's a curse that I've been doing that. But this is, I think, what the public need to know, is that looking down the road everywhere in the developed welfare states, we've got this huge problem of living beyond our means, and it's manifest in debt and in debasing the currency that's in your savings accounts.
And that's not changing here either with either candidates running for president. Both are arguably working for the Fed. They're both singing the Fed's book. They both want lower rates and more debt, and they refuse to speak to exactly what you're talking about, the incessant rampant increase in debt and what that truly means globally in a system that is based on trust, one that has arguably been squandered away through our monetary and fiscal irresponsibility. We're creating $100,000 worth of debt per second, a trillion every 90 days, roughly. A trillion seconds ago was 31,688 years ago. And you wonder, at what point does the world start to truly push back against this Keynesian failed experiment based upon taxation and debt, rather than, as you speak of, to the Austrian school, which just makes so much more sense. And I agree with you. If people just took the time to understand something as fundamental as a system that is based upon savings, investment, and reinvestment, the brick house in the Three Little Pigs story versus the straw house that is based upon an ever increasing edifice of debt and taxation. And you get to a point where you can't continue to tax, you can't squeeze more blood from the turnip. Where does it come from? That's what all politicians have chosen to do, rather than to normalize the balance sheet and blow up the pension funds. We're sorry, we'll back off, and we will go back to easing and accommodating and choose off inflation over the tough decisions. Have we reached the point of no return? Is there a solution? Or will this Keynesian experiment end in the trash heap of history books in a disastrous outcome?
It could result in a disastrous outcome, I'm afraid, and I'm very clear about that, and I have been for a long time. But we do need to offer hope, and the hope actually is in common sense. People know that real resources matter, and this is what it doesn't suit government systems to recognize, is that everything we produce has got to be consumed by someone. And this is why manipulating interest rates goes wrong, because if you have cheap credit, that sends a signal that there have been real resources produced and saved. So if you artificially lower savings rate, interest rates, that creates the impression that there is a big pool of savings to be borrowed. It's like supply and demand. But that, of course, is not how our monetary system works. So when the central banks suppress interest rates and create debt, it's like any kind of sugar rush. It makes you feel great while it lasts, just as you could feel great while you were out there spending on your credit card. But it's bound to end in disaster. And this is the bubble, the biggest bubble in history, I believe, as Andy Haldane, the chief economist of the Bank of England then said, the biggest bubble in history, deliberately blown. And that's been kept in the air for a long time, much longer than I expected. Asset prices, I believe, now are really quite disconnected from the underlying economic realities, particularly if you look at, say, houses in the UK. The combination of cheap credit, state land use planning, and indeed immigration, however uncomfortable it may be to say, those are the things which are driving up house prices. And it's creating massive injustice for young people. Everyone needs somewhere to live. So politicians need to re-engage with real life and real resources, and that you cannot conjure real resources out of thin air by making credit cheap. That is going to require the economics profession to really think again about time, about money, about interest, about what capital actually means. We need a paradigm shift, and we can't have it too soon.
Let me tell you something, Steve. I'd elect you. I'd vote for you 10 seconds ago. You got my vote. And that type of logic is missing. It's gone. And you don't hear anyone talking about the debt or the ramifications of it. In fact, Just in the past couple of months, we've added 485 billion in debt to the ever-growing mountain of it. And to your point of an expansion of government, I don't know how it is in the UK, but the information that comes out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a three-letter acronym, BLS. If I had my choice, I would remove the BLS from that acronym and call it what it is, BS. And they just came out and talked about this massive 254,000 job increase leading up into the election. And it's great, it's strong. The employment numbers are looking great. Yeah, what they didn't tell us actually is that from that, there were 785,000 governmental jobs added in the month of September. You can't make this crap up. The biggest ever surge in government workers on record. We actually experienced a 458,000 job loss in the month of September, but that's hidden by this nonsense. And so you're right. I would argue that the politicians don't know about it, nor do the people, because the information that we are being fed, and maybe even the information that is being fed to the politicians, is so far removed from reality and sanity that at some point this whole thing is going to have some sort of a resolution. When you suppress interest rates globally the way that we have, the distortions and misallocations of resource and capital are becoming too big to hide from. And the same thing is true here. The dream of owning a house in the United States is becoming almost unattainable for kids coming out of college. And for the first time in my life, it's as if the birthright that we all thought we had, that we were entitled to live better than our parents and our grandparents, this may be the first generation in the last 4 or 5 where that isn't true. And I applaud you for having the courage to say this in public forums, because it's true. What has happened, this Keynesian experiment of suppression of interest rates, of massive debt accumulation, and finding it okay to tax instead of making the responsible choice of fiscal responsibility, is going to lead to a very bad place. And I don't know who's going to cross the finish line first, whether it be the United States or the UK, but I do think that it doesn't spell a good outcome for the West. And maybe this is why we're seeing so much in the way of hard assets move to the East, as they are preparing for this ultimate meeting of, I guess, the rubber meeting the road.
Yeah, and that rubber meeting the road, it could be extremely serious. And, I don't like to be an alarmist, because ultimately the arc of human history is upwards. If people look at humanprogress.org, they can see that the fact is that life gets better. That's the long arc of history. But unfortunately, occasionally the arc of history, as it were, is interrupted. It's interrupted by great crises, and bubbles burst. That's what happens. The biggest bubble in history has been blown. And I'm really concerned about it. And the reason I'm concerned is that millions of ordinary people have no other means of support in their old age than the state pension. They rely on the NHS for their healthcare. They rely on the state for their social care when they're older, and they've got no other means of support. And it's a cruelty to them not to confront these issues and deal with them. And the only way to deal with them is to grow the economy. The OBR chart there shows the sensitivity of the debt projection to productivity. It's really important to understand the significance of productivity. What does it really mean? It means people producing more with less and in less time. And if you look at these charts, the blue line there is a lower productivity assumption, and there goes the debt rocketing away. But on the yellow, higher productivity line, we can cope with the debt. So what we need to do is really focus on what it means to be productive. And in the UK, there's a lot of talk about a productivity puzzle. I'm afraid I think very often there's no puzzle at all. Regulators force enormous amounts of effort on business people, effort which is not in fact productive. The output of it might well be forms and reports and regulations, but it's not items, products, services which consumers voluntarily value and are willing to engage in free exchange to receive. So we keep forcing unproductive activity on people and then wondering why we're not productive. And I don't think it's that much of a puzzle. There are, of course, enormous ranges of debate about this. But another factor that I'd put to people is we really have to ask ourselves, what is the role of increasing the money supply and productivity? These are important questions when we're talking about capital and capital accumulation. But the good news is AI. AI can radically improve people's productivity, and robotics. with advances in those fields, it may well be, if we proceed effectively, we can drive up productivity. But we're never going to deal with the problem of currency debasement simply by AI. We're going to have honest money which reconnects production and saving with borrowing and consumption. Because at the moment, it's a loose joint in the whole system, as I think Hayek said, and that loose joint is in danger of breaking the whole machine.
But Steve, you made an analogy earlier on, about a fantastic analogy about candy floss. The world is, especially in the West, the world's addicted to sugar, and we keep on eating sugar in everything that we consume. But people know that sugar's bad for you, and yet they still keep on doing it. Is there a problem with this, and to do with democracy? Is democracy at the heart of the problem? Because at the end of the day, people will keep on voting for sugar, i.e., they will keep on voting for the money printing that artificially stimulates these highs.
Yeah, this is an unfortunate fact that democracy is the worst kind of government, apart from all the others that have been tried from time to time. And the best defense against this phenomenon is an educated and interested and engaged public, which is why your podcast and others like it are so important. Because only when the public are demanding of their politicians, and indeed of economists and other public figures, a system which works sustainably and justly, only when they're demanding that on an informed basis will things change. But yeah, you're right. In a democracy, unfortunately, there's a phenomenon titled rational ignorance, and it's an unfortunate name. But if you're a voter in a constituency and you're one of 75,000 people voting, your individual vote can make very little difference at the ballot box. And yet, of course, as a former elected politician, I know all too well that they all add up. So voting's really important. But what people don't really realize is that if you join a political party, you can sometimes be one of only 50 or 100 people in the room, either holding the elected politician to account within the party structure or selecting the next candidate. And now the US context is, of course, very different because the way your system works, we've got far lower limits on campaign spending here in the UK. People might be amazed, for example, that in the UK, a general election campaign for a parliamentary seat would cost about £20,000. But I remember a senator telling me that he needed to raise $20,000 a day for his campaign. So vastly different spending. But in a UK context, and no doubt in a US context, power goes to those who turn up. So I'd encourage anyone to inform themselves, stay calm, stay polite, but go and see their politicians, go to the meetings, engage, and make clear what you want is an honest system, one where politicians and the state live within their means, and the public get to keep more of their money, because clearly what can't go on will stop, and it might stop in a very ugly manner.
I've lost 8 kilos, by the way, in the last 8 months. I hope you all noticed.
Good for
but,
you. Yeah.
But it was painful. You know, there's a point when you're addicted to certain things and you're eating them all the time, that going from that to a more sustainable, better for you diet, there's an adjustment that needs to happen, and it's difficult to do. It's why a lot of people can't make it through that, Lexi, through that point. Now, of course, I've done it. I feel better. I'm more energized. I'm more productive. I'm doing better things. But it's that pain point. And are people willing to accept that pain? Because what does it mean to move to a more sound money environment, to not be printing the money to give people what they want? People want to have a wonderful national health service. They want to be able to have money in their pensions. Young people want help to get onto the ladder. But to go from where we are, totally addicted to money printing, to a world where there are lower taxes, less printing, the focus on productivity, and the real allocation of resources, how do we go through that?
We're probably going to have to go through a horrible crisis. And when I was first elected, I believed that I could argue my way through this, that I could explain to people the problems that we face and persuade the state, the politicians, the economists that we needed to change. And over 14 years, that has proven impossible. Nobody wants to be the bringer of bad news. And it's a terrible phenomenon. And I don't want this difficulty. Let's make no mistake. I don't want the difficulties which I foresee. But I'm afraid everywhere, if one lives beyond one's means, eventually it catches up. So I don't think politicians can be persuaded, not least because I once sat in a room of about 30 members of parliament with Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister. And of course, he was previously Chancellor. And we talked through these issues just as we have today, talking about government living beyond its means, borrowing and debauching the currency. And I don't think Rishi would mind me saying he recognises these phenomena. And the members of parliament around the table all said, yeah, well, okay, there was a really sorrowful moment. We need to do something about this, but not at this election. And it's always the same, not at this election. And this is the problem. Until the public demand change and demand it in numbers, until what Hayek called the intellectuals, he was being a bit satirical. The people who ask the questions on the TV shows, we need to reach journalists. We need to reach those who sit there, the Andrew Neils of this world, to get them to ask the questions which lead politicians to answer these fundamental issues. Why do you tolerate a system which lives beyond our means and stores up debts and misallocations, dislocations in the economy and injustice, which backfire later? Why do you tolerate it? And most politicians won't be able to answer. But you know what? I don't mind if politicians are humiliated by their ignorance and then replaced. And the sooner the ignorant ones are replaced, the much better it will be for the public.
Yeah, you might as well throw the journalists out with them. It just seems that journalistic integrity is dead here in the United States anyway, where everything you just said is spot on, and yet nothing is ever talked about. Nothing material is ever talked about in the news. And that's just it. You have well-read people reading the wrong stuff, completely misguided. And when you talk about the politicians always choosing inflation over austerity and the people always wanting the handout, if the people really understood what that means, the privilege that the West has enjoyed for all of these years, what it truly would mean to have a sea change where the dollar no longer is the world reserve currency, where everything is moving in a different direction. What does it mean to our standard of living? And I think that's part of the problem. You look at every single TV station, newspaper, radio station in the United States, they're all owned by 6 companies. And it's very interesting. Oftentimes you can see they'll show it like on Twitter. They'll take snippets from every single broadcast, NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox, all of them. And they all say the same 10, 12 words in their newscast, the same exact piece of information. They're all rehashing it. And journalistic integrity is, I'm not trying to paint such a gloomy picture, but it just seems that this is bigger than the news media and the people trying to stand up. It just seems that this is very coordinated. And you have to ask yourself, if that really is the case, what is the reason? Don't you think that the people pulling the strings see the ultimate outcome here? What does that mean? Does that mean that we're all so far indebted and they've realized it and they're trying to reset the system? They're trying to push it past the point of no return. We're already at that point, north of 100% debt to GDP, closer to 123%. There's really never been a country that's crossed 130 and come back. And I don't know what the UK is, but my point is that I've been hoping for journalistic integrity for a long time. And none of these important topics that we've discussed here today, you hear word one of on anything that resembles a financial news station or news outlet.
Andy, you raised such an important point. And funnily enough, I was discussing it with a young man earlier today who started to see big patterns at work. And I would tell anyone, there's no conspiracy to just use that word. There's no conspiracy. And if there is, I've not been indoctrinated into it. But I would say that, wouldn't I? Look, the truth is there's just incompetence, there's ignorance, there's consensus, there's institutions founded on all those things. And they just carry this failing consensus forward. And yeah, groupthink is an incredibly powerful force. I'm actually going to start a company in this field because I recognize it's such a powerful force across a range of fields. I can't talk about that today because it has to be cleared by a boring government committee. But by the by, that will happen soon. But groupthink's very powerful and people find it just hardwired into them to agree with others and go with the flow and the consensus and not to be that one who says, oh, hang on a minute. What is really going on here? And it's very true of economists and central bankers. It's very true of politicians. And I'm afraid with 14 years of experience in Parliament, including many of those years on the Treasury Select Committee, from my point of view, what I see is people, worried about their own promotion prospects, not wanting to be different to the crowd, people not wanting to be the one who bursts the bubble, people really not understanding the arguments. Economics, you've mentioned Keynes a couple of times. Economics is in such a mess. Keynes produced what is known as a paradigm shift. He challenged some of the fundamental bases of the economics profession, and he rebased the entire knowledge and thesis of economics into a new place. The trouble is he was wrong himself. And for example, Keynesian economics, in its use of mathematics, aggregates away important detail like time. You can't assume that the iron ore in the car retailed today was produced today. It wasn't. The iron ore was mined from the ground probably years ago, and this production time matters. But Keynesian economics, with its circular flow, just assumes away time, and that's a really important mistake. The other mistake they make is knowledge and information. The information you need to make their maths works it's in people's heads, but sometimes it's tacit. Not even the person thinking it knows until they discover. I can go into Starbucks in the morning. I don't know whether I'll have tea or coffee or what kind of coffee until I get in there. You can't possibly plan for that. It's just a simple example. I didn't know I needed a smartphone until they were available. Now I have two. I did have four. There's just no accounting for this information. It needs to be discovered in markets by entrepreneurs, by consumers through free prices, free exchange, prices, profit, and crucially loss. And I'm afraid the assumptions of modern economics are that they can obtain the information that they need. This was the subject of Hayek's Nobel lecture. That's a mistake. And they also assume away time. And those two mistakes in particular desperately need correcting in the body of economic thought. And if those mistakes were corrected, then the economics profession would have another paradigm shift. And they would realize what a terrible mistake it's been to have so much control over interest rates and the money supply. And they would realize that they have been, as a matter of policy, fundamentally misdirecting the economy and misallocating capital and creating dislocations which lead to injustice. I can't wait for that day to come.
Yeah, I look at it as messing with Mother Nature. When you mess with Mother Nature, you'll be sorry, because she always gets her revenge. And those distortions, well, what is the basic tenet of Austrian economics? Any massive injection of credit and low interest rates is always preceded by a collapse, right? Or a crash.
Yeah. But
something
can I
like
ask
that.
you guys?
But there is, I think, keep your point, Steve. But there is a glint of hope, pun intended. But there is, and I've seen it in the US. So the country with this huge amount of debt, 35 trillion. What I've seen there is an amazing groundswell movement, a bottom-up return to sound money, being driven by ordinary people. Okay, not by Glint. Get Glint off there. I wasn't meaning to do a plug for Glint. But what I've seen is that groups of women, men, young people, legislators, all coming together, and maybe it's because they have this republic system, where you've got states that are able to keep the Fed in balance and vice versa. You have this other elected body at the state level, and those people are very close to the people. They're very close. I've seen them. They are people in business, in the community, not being paid, very little resources. They run and they get elected into the legislature. And they put forward bills, and these bills come from ideas that they've even developed themselves and got support from, or directly from the community. And we see now across 20 US states them wanting to have change, and they're either drafting, implementing, have implemented legislation that's going to make gold legal tender, which is the ultimate sound money, cannot be printed. Now, this is not actually changing central banks, but what I can't help think that this is going to create a mirror to the US dollar and a mirror to the money printing that's going to force the federal or central government to change. What I think we've got to take in the UK some inspiration from this movement. It's exactly what you've been talking about, podcasters. Maybe the mainstream media is dead. Some of these pods are much bigger than the mainstream media. I hope we can make a difference. But in the UK, Steve, what do you think? Surely there's a way we can do that here.
This bottom-up return to sound money is happening around the world, and it is a source of great inspiration and encouragement and hope. And whether it's the private sector bringing money back into the payment system, which of course you're intimately involved in, or whether it's Bitcoin, it's a sign that people are coming together through voluntary cooperation to create different monies which better suit their needs of preserving purchasing power. Now, at the risk of upsetting Bitcoin fans, right now, Bitcoin is not a money because it's not generally accepted, but it has got the tantalizing prospect of offering what you could call a synthetic commodity money. That's what my friend Professor George Selgin says, that the prospect of becoming a synthetic commodity money. And whether people like it or not, whether central banks like it or not, the public are coming together and they are innovating with gold, with other precious metals, and with Bitcoin. They're innovating to make possible a bottom-up return to sound money. And that is the most amazing product of a technological revolution that is the internet.
You were going to say something, I rudely interrupted. Can you remember what you were going to say?
I was going to ask you, would you please bring up that chart of currency debasement? So this is a really important slide. This is a price index back to 1750, produced by the Office for National Statistics in the UK and the House of Commons Library. So really mainstream establishment statistical bodies who are regarded as authoritative. And they produce this paper. The chart on the left is on a linear scale. The one on the right is a log scale that brings out the fine detail in the lower values.
Can you just explain that to people who don't understand log scales?
Log scales, yeah, it just compresses the big numbers. Just leave it at that, because otherwise we'll have a lecture on logarithm.
No, that's it. Yeah, it's the same. It's the same data presented, so it's a bit more obvious on the right.
It's like bringing a magnifying glass over the small values. On the chart on the right, you can see the detail that's lost in the chart on the left. But the really important thing that matters here is that it is obvious to anyone looking at that there are two different monetary environments at work there. In the last 50 years, there's been massive inflation. That line goes nearly vertical. But up to the turn of the 20th century, money was holding its value. So you've got a horizontal line, then you've got a bit of inflation coming through the two world wars, and then you've got a near vertical line during the 50 years of my life since Bretton Woods ended. Now, what did Bretton Woods do? It tied the dollar ultimately to gold. Now, when Nixon ended the Bretton Woods system, he broke that last link to gold, which restrained the creation of new money. And that chart shows absolutely clearly that when he did that, he inaugurated a categorically different monetary environment. Money has been collapsing in value throughout our lifetimes. The log scale just brings out the detail that in the 19th century, during the Industrial Revolution, when money was gold, there was some price fluctuations and they will have felt like crises at the time. But money actually held its value overall for 100 years. If anything, it increased in value. And that didn't prevent the Industrial Revolution from happening. And the truth is that the sustainable, just and inclusive prosperity is built on sound money. And that's why I'm so excited about what the private sector is doing, what people are doing through voluntary cooperation in gold, in silver, in Bitcoin. People are coming together to procure that bottom-up return to sound money, which I think stands as an example to the state and to politicians everywhere. It can be done. It is being done.
When I look at that chart, I see 180 years of no inflation and great prosperity. Some of the greatest prosperity the world has ever seen, whether it be in the United Kingdom or the United States. And the ignorance of thinking that sound money, you can't run a monetary system with it being tied to sound money. I think that chart proves that's not true.
It absolutely does, yeah. And unfortunately, because for 50 years we've all lived in this environment of chronic inflation, and it's categorical and it's a matter of fact, there it is. But and when I say inflation, of course, overall degrading of the purchasing power of money, I'm not talking about the CPI number that comes forward. We made the mistake running up to the global financial crisis of not looking at house price inflation. And people are still very reluctant to look at house price inflation. But how's money created? It's created by banks lending. Where do they lend that money? They lend it into mortgages. They lend it into housing. So that pumps up the price of housing. Now, again, it's like Nelson with his famous story of his telescope. He said, I see no ships. And if you don't look at where the bubble is being blown, of course, you won't see it. So at the moment, we're in a massive spiral of state failure, a failure of politicians to confront the issue, partly because they don't even understand them. and a failure of central bankers to really understand what their part in the system. I don't think central bankers, having grilled them personally over many years in the House of Commons, I don't think central bankers want to confront the possibility that I've put before them over many years, that the monetary system over which they preside is complicit in pumping up this bubble and creating really grave risks to our whole civilization. That's how Hayek characterized it at the back of the Pure Theory of Capital. And one notable exception to this is, of course, Andy Haldane, the former chief economist of the Bank of England. He said himself that we have blown the biggest bubble in history, bond market bubble in history. And he was right. And of course, it hasn't burst yet. But the amazing fact is that it's been kept blown for so many years.
And do you think that we could still, is there a scenario where you can see that when we don't have this money printing, but we're still able to have a national health service, we're still able to support people in their old age, and not my particular passion, but be able to defend our country should it need to?
Yeah, but we've got to face up to doing it within our means. And this is what's extremely tricky. We got through COVID not by drawing on an enormous pool of savings, but by issuing bonds into the bond market and the Bank of England then hoovering them up out of the bond market using QE. Now, there wasn't direct monetization of that debt. It was indirect, and it was done by the independent Bank of England. But if people dig out the charts, they'll see a chart of the QE coming up that parallels the bond issuance. This is a really severe problem. And we could get to a situation where everything we rely on is at risk. Now, that's obviously not what I want. I'm much freer to talk about these things for not seeking re-election. But we've got to provide for healthcare for people. We've got to provide pensions. We need to provide social care better than we do now. This is not to even get started on special educational needs. You know, the needs of the public, and they are real needs, are profound. The question is not whether one could suspend providing for people. It's a question of providing for those who need it most, maximizing well-being, and letting people go free who don't need to be in the embrace of the state. And this is what we haven't really confronted. For large numbers of people, we just don't want the government in our lives. We don't need the government in our lives. And in fact, sometimes we're both paying for healthcare through the tax system and then paying for healthcare when we go private. People do that in the school system as well, increasingly in policing, paying for private security. And paying twice for things is just wrong. We need to face up to a failing social system, which we cannot afford. We can't afford it. It doesn't work very well. But of course, we need to be providing healthcare for those who would otherwise go without. That is non-negotiable in a civilized society. Likewise, pensions and healthcare. We are far too long down this road to be revisiting those principles. But the question that is going to crystallize some very hard decisions is, how do you do it affordably?
Steve, that's a great place to end, I think, today's podcast on. Thank you so much for coming on. Listeners, you heard Steve at the beginning. He wants to hear about what you think. Give us your comments. Give Steve your comments. Write them down. We can't have a discussion about this unless we're joined up and we're involved. So get involved. This is where you can start. Steve, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. Andy, great to see you again, as always, my friend.
You too, Steve. Amazing. You're a politician that we could use your help over here in the U.S. So
well, I'll be glad to come. There's a possibility I'll come towards the end of this year and possibly into next year. But let me tell you, I'm not going to be seeking re-election. But I'll be glad to come over. I'll be glad to see you.
Yeah, by the way, I got a pint of beer with your name on it. Love to pick your brain some more. And but thanks for coming on the show. Your thoughts and your beliefs are spot on, and I wish more people thought the same way you did. The economy and future of this country and of yours would be much better. So cheers to you, Andy, and best of luck to you. Yeah, absolutely.
And as I hear the rain beating down on my own roof, can I just say my thoughts are with the people of Florida as we head into this hurricane, and I wish them well and Godspeed.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.